Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. We are up to the laws of Tumas Meis, chapter 8. It's Thursday. So let's start with a look at where we are up to in the Rambam. We are learning the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which has a total of 14 volumes. We are up to volume number 10, believe it or not. And Sefer Tahara is a big volume. Sefer Tahara is the largest volume of the Rambam with a 144 chapters. Well, what are we going to speak about for 144 chapters of Tahara, of staying pure? Let's take a look. So we have a total of 8 topics. The first topic is Tumas Meis, impurity imparted from the dead. There are 25 chapters on that. Then there is the Para Aduma, how that brings a person purity and can also make a person impure. 15 chapters on that. We'll learn all about the impurity of Tzora'as, which a person would receive for different reasons, such as speaking Lashon Hara. We'll learn about the Tumah of Mishkav or Moshav, impurity to the places that a person lies or sits on. Sha'ar Avos HaTumos, other sources of Tumah. We'll learn about impurity that comes from or goes to foods, impurity that goes to vessels, and finally mikvahs, which bring a person back to purity. So that's what we have on the horizon. We are right now in Tumas Meis, chapter 8. So Tumas Meis, before we get to chapter 8, deals with, can be broken up into 5 topics. This isn't from the Rambam. The Rambam just has 25 chapters in Tumas Meis, but in the volume of Rambam that I've been preparing with, which is called Mifal Mishnah Torah, it actually has a breakdown of each of the topics. And the first 5 chapters, we learned about sources and recipients of Tumah, that of impurity of the dead. Then the next 5 chapters speak about the grave and how that gives impurity. The next chapter deals about with the land of the nations, its impurity, land outside of Israel. The next 8 chapters deal with Tumah being transmitted via a canopy, via oil, by something that goes over the person. And the final 6 chapters deal with barriers of Tumas oil, how a person can be under the same canopy as Tumah, and in certain circumstances, how an item can still be protected from becoming Tameh. So that's what we have on the horizon, 25 chapters. Baruch Hashem, we're already up to chapter 8. So we'll be doing this for another approximately 2 weeks before we move on to the next topic of Para Aduma. Let's take a look at today's chapter, chapter 8. If a grave becomes lost in a field, we know that there's a grave somewhere here, but we don't know where it is. So now that entire field becomes Tameh. And the earth of that field becomes Tameh. And it will make somebody Tameh if a person either touches it or carries it. Just like the earth of a Beis HaPras, which is a field where we've learned about already, where it was plowed over. So here it's not where the field was plowed over. It's not where a dead person was plowed over. Rather, it's where in this field, somewhere there is a caver, a grave, and you're not sure where it is. So why is everything impure? For perhaps the grave that was there was crushed, and there are bones the size of a barley corn in its earth. That's why even the earth is impure. Similarly, one who stands over any portion of the fields, Tumas oil, meaning under the same canopy. If you have a canopy that goes over both you and the field, then you become Tameh, because you never know. Right under you might be the Tumah, or right next to you might be the Tumah. If one builds a structure there, everything inside the structure becomes impure, becomes Tameh. Or perhaps the structure he constructed in that field is actually over the grave. So we don't know where exactly this grave is, and so therefore we say any structure becomes impure. But in halacha number 2, And that's when we come to the diagram. If a person built a house, first story, and then he had a second story. Now, the entrance to the house has a lintel that sticks out. That's my understanding of this. So if the entrance to the second floor, I don't know how people got up there, I guess with a ladder. So if the entrance to the second floor was directly on top of the entrance to the first floor, then the second floor is pure. Why? Because even if the impurity is under the house or under the whatever the lintel that sticks out of the door frame that sticks out, so since the one is directly on top of the other, so then the bottom floor would become Tameh, but the top floor would not become Tameh because it's separate. However, if the even if the grave was under the lintel of the house, the loft is pure. So even if it was right here under the lintel, this higher floor would be pure. But there's one structure on top of another one, as we'll learn about. If they were not directly above each other, meaning if this entrance is not on top of that entrance, then the loft, the second floor, is impure. Why? Because it could be that the Meis, the grave, is directly under the lintel of this doorway, and there's nothing blocking the Tumas from going straight there and entering into the entire house.
So it's not the structure, it's the entrance that's important.
Well, there's two things. For the lower floor, regardless of the entrance, anywhere that you are in the house, you might be on top of the grave. But the higher floor has this buffer zone. The higher floor has an empty space underneath it. So if there was a dead person under this house, then the impurity would go onto the first floor. But since the second floor is sealed, the entrance is only from the outside, the impurity would have no way of going to the second floor, and the second floor would remain pure. The only issue that remains for the second floor is any canopy that is not buffered, that's not protected by the first floor. So that's the question. If the second doorway is directly on top of the first, then it means that there is no canopy that the second floor has that isn't already covered by the first floor. Because even if this has a canopy here, there's already a canopy right under it. So it's completely protected. This is complete buffer zone. But if the entrance is over here, then it means that this second floor has a canopy going over the field, which has not been separated from the field. And therefore, we don't know. Maybe the dead person is right there. Maybe the grave is right there. And then the impurity would be able to go straight onto the second floor.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Halacha number 3. It is permitted to sow any type of seeds in this field. Why? Because the roots of the plants growing from the seeds won't reach the grave. The grave is planted deep beneath the earth. One should not, however, plant fruit trees. Why? Because a tree's roots go much deeper, and their roots will reach the corpse. We don't want that to happen. We operate under the presumption that, so this is now a new halacha. So the first discussion was about a field where a grave was lost. I forgot what it's called. I guess maybe it's just a field that a grave was lost. Not a Beis HaPras. A Beis HaPras is something else when the field is plowed over. Now we're not talking about a field that was plowed over. We're just talking about a field that we know there's a grave somewhere and we're not sure where it is. The next scenario, it's interesting the way the halachas are divided, is in the middle of halacha number 3, there would be these low hills. My understanding of a low hill is kind of like a little mound of earth. So if these hills are close to a town and near a cemetery, or to the road leading to the cemetery, whether it's a new cemetery or an old cemetery, these little mounds of earth are impure. We operate under that presumption. Why? Because women bury fetuses that they miscarry there, and lepers bury their limbs there. It should never happen to anybody, but I guess back in the day, a woman was if she had to deal with the miscarriage, she would want to bury it without people knowing about it, if it was early in the pregnancy, which would be the case today as well, where people, unfortunately, sometimes in early pregnancy goes through a miscarriage and they don't want people to know about it. Nowadays, Baruch Hashem, we have the Chevra condition that would be able to collect the fetus, the baby, and ensure that it is buried properly. But back in the day, where a woman wouldn't want anybody to know about it, she would possibly go outside and bury this fetus herself. And the place that she would choose to do that would be in these mounds. And therefore, if these mounds are near a city and near the cemetery or the road to the cemetery, then we would assume that it's actually impure. So the first scenario was where there's a field and we know there's a grave beneath it, but we're not sure where it is. The second scenario is where there's a mound which lends itself to a woman burying the fetuses there, or leper over here means people whose limbs would just fall off, some other kind of sickness. And so they would need to bury them. Any limb of it needs to be buried, or the person needs to be buried. So people would bury their own limbs. And again, these mounds would facilitate for that. Different rules apply to those hills which are distant from a town. If it's distant from a town, so if it's a new hill, we'll see what new and old means in a moment, then it's pure. But if it's an old hill, then it's impure. Why? Because maybe they were close to a town that was destroyed or a road that was lost. If it's a new hill, then we know that it was never close to town, so it's fine. If it's an old hill, then it could be that there used to be a city right there. And therefore, we would go under the presumption that it lent itself to being impure. What do we mean by close to a town? Any hill that doesn't have another hill closer than it. So that's what it means close. And it's basically the first stop outside of the city. What is meant by an old one? One that no one remembers whether there was a cemetery there or not. That's already old. And therefore, we would be able to, it would be impure even if it wasn't right next to town. Okay, so we spoke about these mounds, these low hills. The following laws apply to a field for weeping, meaning a place near a cemetery where women would sit and cry over the departed. Even though this place's earth is pure, the earth is pure, because it has not been established that a corpse is buried there, trees should not be planted there, nor should crops be sown there, kind of like the field we mentioned earlier where a grave was lost. Why? So as not to have people frequent it. Or perhaps a corpse was buried there. So this is a crying space outside of the cemetery that's close to the cemetery, which again lends itself to perhaps that people may have privately buried somebody there and we think it's pure and it's not. So then the rabbis didn't say that earth is impure. They did say that that earth should not be planted as trees so as not to bring people to a place that might be impure. Our sages had the suspicion because its owner will have despaired of its use because it is close to the cemetery. So since it's a place that the owner doesn't plan on using, it's not prime location. Therefore, it is possible that a person will come and bury a corpse there. But one may use the earth in such a place to make ovens or to cook meat because the earth is not considered impure. We just say that we don't want trees to be planted there. Okay, what about moving a grave? Very interesting topic. Are you allowed to move a grave? So here's the answer. If a person discovers a grave on their property, right, this could particularly happen maybe in Israel, which is a land of great heritage, so it is permitted to remove the corpse and rebury it elsewhere because it's on your property. If it was reburied, the place around the first grave is impure, and you're not allowed to benefit from it until it is checked, as will be explained. So when the body is being moved, one needs to be sure that no source of impurity was left behind. When it is known that a grave is located in the field, so this is if it was just discovered one day. One day you discovered it in the field, but if you knew that it was there, then you wouldn't be allowed to remove it. But if it was removed for whatever reason, then the space around it will be pure because since you knew about it, so you knew how far the impurity went. So once you removed it, you will know that whatever left behind is pure. When the grave causes harm to people at large, then the corpse should be removed, disinterred and then reburied. Its place is impure and it is forbidden to benefit from it, because you're talking about a scenario where it was there before. It wasn't just suddenly discovered. There was a big debate, or I don't know about debate, an issue of contention in Israel, where they wanted to build highways, and part of the places they wanted to build those highways were places where there were cemeteries. So I know that there were big protests against this because people obviously didn't want the cemeteries to be disrespected. I'm not sure exactly what or wasn't in place, but it just reminded me of that. Halacha number 7, a Meis mitzvah, a very big important mitzvah. This is the only person that a high priest is allowed to become impure to. Even if a high priest's very own mother or father died, he would not be allowed to become impure. He would not be allowed to bury them. He would have to appoint somebody else. When it comes to a Meis mitzvah, what is a Meis mitzvah? So that's somebody who, there's a dead body that's found, or somebody dies, and there is nobody to take care of him. So if the person encounters a Meis mitzvah, if it's within the city's limits, Shabbos limits, how far you can walk on Shabbos, which is about a kilometer, then you should bring it to the cemetery. But if it was outside of the Shabbos limits, so the halacha of a Meis mitzvah is that it is buried wherever it is found. If you found it in the public thoroughfare, so you don't want to bury it in the middle of where everybody needs to walk, you should move it to the side. If an uncultivated field was on one side and a plowed field on the other, and you're exactly middle line, so we're talking about it's outside of the city limits for Shabbos, and therefore it needs to be buried exactly where it's found, but it's borderline. Either you could bury it in the uncultivated fields, this person, or you could bury him in the cultivated field or the plowed field. Which side should you bury him in? Obviously the uncultivated field, because that will be causing less damage. Similarly, if there was a plowed field on one side and a field that had not only been plowed but also been sown, seeds had already been put in it, then he should bury it on the plowed field, not on the sown field. If it's a field that has been sown on the one side and on the other side of vineyards, then obviously he should bury it on the side of the field that's just been sown. If there was an orchard on one side and a vineyard on the other, then you should bury it in the vineyard because of the impurity of oil, because a vineyard doesn't give as much of a canopy as does a full tree. If both fields were of equal value, then he could bury it wherever he chooses. So that's the halacha of a Meis mitzvah. It can be buried wherever it's found if it's outside of the city limits. Okay, the final 3 halachas deal with a discovered grave. If a grave is discovered, it imparts impurity retroactively, meaning that if somebody walked over the roads today and then tomorrow they dig it up because the electricity is not working, so they try to uncover some pipes and they find that there's a Jewish dead body that's been buried there. So the person that walked there yesterday will now discover that he actually became pure yesterday, impure. He became tamei. He thought he was just going for a stroll and he didn't know he was walking over the source of impurity. Well, now that he knows, he'll need to go to mikveh and have the whole process of purification done with him. But that is only if there was nobody knew otherwise. But if someone says that it is clear to me that there was not a grave here, I previously worked in the space and there was nothing there. Even if he's talking about 20 years ago, so since we have a precedent of it being clean, of it being tahar, so then we say it keeps that status quo until the moment the person finds out that it was tamei. And therefore, somebody who walked on it beforehand would be pure because we say that maybe it was subsequent to him going over that space that the person was buried there. Halacha number 9, whenever a person discovers a grave or a corpse or a portion of a corpse that would impart impurity through oihel, so he should designate it so that it will not create an obstacle for others. He should demarcate the space so that a kohen knows not to go there. I remember a little while back, I was by part of the procession of a cemetery, and a good friend of mine, a kohen, came to stand next to me, and I just pointed up. There was a huge tree on top of us, and he ran because a kohen is not allowed to be under the same canopy, even a tree, of the impure. So that's why a person should make a mark so people know. During Chol HaMoed, the intermediary days of Pesach and Sukkot, agents of the court, Shluchei Beis Din, would go out to designate the graves. They would go out to ensure that all the graves have been demarcated, have been marked. A designation is not made over a portion of a corpse that is exactly the size of an olive. So if it was just about of a particular part of a person that had been buried there for whatever reason, I would not want to know, and it was exactly the minimum size that gives off impurity, then they would not have to mark it, because by the time they finish marking it, will probably disintegrate and be less than the minimum size, and then it actually wouldn't impart impurity at all. But what is the designation made? How do they show that there is a dead person buried here? With lime. It should be mixed and poured over the place of the impurity. The designation should not be placed on the exact perimeters of the impurity, but instead should extend somewhat, slightly extend on either side, so as not to ruin pure articles. So people have a slight buffer zone, but it should only be slight. Designation should not be extended much beyond the place of the impurity, so as not to spoil Israel, because wherever you made that designation, it means people can't go there. So you don't want to eat up too much land, you just want to make sure that people are safe. Designation is not made on places that are definitely known to be used for burial, but their identity is universally known. So you're not going to have to mark a tombstone for somebody that died if you know that the whole area is full of kfarim. Only other places that are doubtful, meaning a field in which a grave was lost, or the low-hanging branches of trees, or rocks jutting out of the wall, those are places that a person would need to make a mark so people know that there is a caver, a grave in that place. When a person discovers a field that has been designated and does not know what the nature of the problem is, so he sees that it's been designated, but he's not sure designated for what. What is the source of impurity? So you should follow these guidelines. If there are no trees on the fields, then you can assume that there was probably a grave lost in that field, and that's why there were no trees, because we said one doesn't plant trees in a field that had a grave lost because the roots go into the ground. If it has trees in it, then you should assume that a grave was plowed over it, as will be explained. So, because we said that the opposite halachas, when a grave is lost, then you could have vegetation but not a tree, because vegetation won't go too deep. But if it's a matter of being plowed over, so then we say a tree is fine because it's going beneath wherever any bones may have spread, as opposed to vegetation, which would be a problem. So based on his observation of how the field is being used, he will have an indication of what made that field impure. When a person finds a stone that is designated, the area under it is impure. There should be two such stones. Should there be two such stones? If there is a line between them, then the area between them is tameh. If there is no line between them, then only on top of them, then we say like this. If there's a shard between them, then they're pure because they are the remnants of a building. If there's no shard between them and a light layer of lime was smoothed out over the heads on either side, so you assume that this is a designation and they are impure. If one boundary line of a field is designated, it is impure and the remainder of the field is pure. This applies only if a second or third boundary line is designated. But if all four boundaries are designated, they're all pure and the field is impure. But the sign should not be placed far from the place of impurities. In summary, we spoke about a field in which a grave was lost. We spoke about a house in that field. We spoke about how such a field can be used. We spoke about mounds of earth, about a crying space, about moving a grave, about burying a Meis for somebody who doesn't have family to look after him. And finally, if a person discovered a grave, what they can do. Let's test our knowledge. If one buys a field that has a grave on the property, is he permitted to disinter it and bury it elsewhere? If you buy a property and you find a grave there, are you allowed to rebury it? What did we say the halacha is?
Yes.
Yes, but you didn't know it was there beforehand. No, you can't. I think maybe you say you can't because the seller did know it was there. I think it's about whether it was generally unknown that's what we say. I suspect. If a grave is discovered on one's property and the previous owner claims that there was never a grave there when they owned it, does it impart ritual impurity retroactively? You only rely on their word when the grave was discovered immediately after the sale, for otherwise they may have forgotten over time. It only imparts impurity from the time the grave is discovered, or yes, it imparts impurity already earlier. Good. Number two, since somebody was able to testify that earlier it was pure, so it keeps that status quo until you prove otherwise. If a corpse is found far outside the city limits, what should be done with it? It should be brought to the nearest city and buried, or it should be buried in its place.
Its place.
Very good. Halacha number 4. Does one contract ritual impurity by simply standing in a field where a grave was lost? No, he needs to actually place a stone there. I don't remember saying that.
Yes.
Did we say that? Oh, contract ritual impurity. I thought designate. Simply, yes, absolutely. By just being in a field, he already contracts ritual impurity. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi.